The stones of the Vatican are not cold. They are hot, burning with the sins of men who wear God's pure white. Rome, the eternal city, the city of saints and martyrs, was poisoned from the top down. It was a place where light met shadow, and the shadow always won. What happens when the shepherd becomes the wolf, and the Holy See becomes the throne of indulgence? This is not a tale of a religious war, but of a quiet murder, the death of pure faith, starved and suffocated inside a golden cage. This is the story of the Renaissance popes, who traded the keys to heaven for the keys to a kingdom of earthly lust, luxury, and unspeakable darkness. It is the story of Brother Alessandro, a young man who came to Rome seeking God, only to find the devil wearing a triple crown. Brother Alessandro rode into Rome in the late summer of 1493, his heart lifting with the dust of the road. He was a simple man from the mountain monasteries, trained as a scribe, and now he was called to serve one of the most powerful men in the entire world, Cardinal Vespucci. Alessandro believed Rome was where the highest men of the church lived closest to God. He expected quiet halls, solemn prayer, and scholarly work. He found none of it. The cardinal's palace was a fortress of marble and silk, larger than the entire village Alessandro came from. Gold leaf covered the ceilings. Servants in bright, expensive silks rushed through the halls, carrying silver trays piled high with sweetmeats and foreign wines. It smelled not of incense and wax, but of rich perfumes and roasting meat. This was not a holy place. It felt like the court of an earthly king, only more expensive, more arrogant. Alessandro was led to his master's chamber. Cardinal Vespucci did not look like the holy men in the paintings. He was large, soft around the edges, and his small eyes were full of impatience, not prayer. He wore crimson robes so fine they shimmered. On his fingers were rings that cost more than 100 poor families would see in a lifetime. "So, you are the new scribe, Alessandro?" the cardinal said, not looking up from a parchment he was signing. "You can read and write? Good. You must also learn to forget what you read and write. That is your most important lesson here." Alessandro did not understand. He was hired to keep records, letters, and important church documents. How could he forget them? "The Holy Father, the Pope himself, is a great man," Cardinal Vespucci continued, finally lifting his head. "He is a man of appetites. He must manage kingdoms, enemies, and a great family. He must be a lion, not a lamb. And a lion's business is often messy. Your job is to make the mess look clean. Do you understand, boy?" Alessandro nodded, though a cold knot was forming in his stomach. That very evening, Alessandro saw the first piece of the darkness. He was hurrying through a back courtyard when he heard a muffled cry. He stopped, hidden by a heavy tapestry. Two men in the livery of the Pope's guard were dragging a third man. The man being dragged was dressed in the simple brown robes of a low-ranking priest. His face was pale and covered in blood. "You should have kept your mouth shut, Father," one of the guards hissed, his voice low and cruel. "The Holy Father's business is holy. To question it is heresy. And to speak of the children is to seal your grave." The priest tried to speak, but the guard kicked him hard in the stomach. The air rushed out of the priest's lungs. Alessandro watched, frozen in the shadow. This was the scene of betrayal and brutality that shocked him to his core. The guards were not punishing a thief or a murderer. They were punishing a man who had talked. They dragged the priest through a hidden door, which quickly slammed shut. The courtyard was silent again, the only evidence being a dark, wet stain on the cobblestones. Alessandro stumbled back to his room. He should have called out. He should have run for help. But the words of the guards, "To speak of the children is to seal your grave," echoed in his mind. The guards acted with the full power of the church behind them, not as criminals. He looked around his small, windowless chamber. He was in Rome, the heart of Christendom, but he felt 1,000 miles away from God. His new life was not one of study and prayer. It was one of witnessing and silence. He realized the cold marble of the palace was not just a decoration. It was the lining of his new cage. To survive, he would have to become a ghost, watching everything but saying nothing, lest he end up like the poor, beaten priest. The true faith he feared had been abandoned on the dusty road, and only the golden mask of power remained. He picked up his quill, ready to begin his work, knowing every word he wrote from now on would be a lie. The days that followed were a blur of gilded lies for Brother Alessandro. He spent his time copying letters filled with grand promises of salvation and peace, while seeing the cruelty hidden just beneath the surface of the palace. The words of faith he copied felt empty. They were just tools used by powerful men. 2 weeks after arriving, Cardinal Vespucci gave Alessandro a new, terrible task. "The Holy Father is having a private dinner tonight," the cardinal whispered, his voice oily with false excitement. "Very private. You will assist the chief steward. You will see things you must never, ever speak of. If you speak, I will not protect you. Understand?" Alessandro felt the familiar cold knot tighten in his gut, but he had no choice. He was a servant, trapped. That evening, he was led across Rome to the Apostolic Palace, the very heart of the church. But they did not go to the formal dining halls. They went down a small, winding staircase to a set of hidden rooms. When Alessandro stepped inside, the air hit him like a physical blow. It was thick with the smell of rich wine, roasted pheasant, and expensive, heavy perfume. The room was lit not by plain candles, but by hundreds of silver oil lamps that made everything glitter. Musicians played fast, wild music, not hymns. The guests were the highest members of the church, cardinals in their bright red, bishops in their purple. But their faces were flushed with wine, and their laughter was loud and reckless. They had shed their holiness like a cloak. Alessandro, dressed in a simple, dark tunic, moved through the room, serving wine. He saw things that made his head spin. A cardinal, who had preached a sermon on abstinence just last Sunday, was openly flirting with a group of women who were certainly not nuns. The women were dressed in scandalous, costly silks. Then Alessandro saw the Pope. The Holy Father sat on a raised chair, laughing louder than anyone. His white robes were beautiful, but his actions were far from sacred. He drank deeply from a gold cup and leaned forward to whisper a joke to the man beside him. A joke so vulgar the man slapped his knee and roared with laughter. This was the very definition of moral hypocrisy. The man who held the key to heaven was behaving like a gluttonous, worldly prince. But the worst came when the Pope introduced 2 young people sitting near him. "This is my son, Cesare, and my daughter, Lucrezia," the Pope announced, his voice beaming with pride. Alessandro froze, dropping a spoon. Everyone knew the Pope was not supposed to have children. Yet, here they were, grown, beautiful, and treated as royal heirs within the sacred walls of the Vatican. The Pope spoke of them, his illegitimate family, with more love and pride than any spiritual matter. The cardinals rushed forward to congratulate the Pope on his children, treating the matter as ordinary political dealings. The highest leaders of the church were not only ignoring the Pope's sin, they were celebrating it. They were using the church's vast machinery and wealth to serve their personal indulgences and family ambitions. Later, Alessandro found himself near a small room where a few cardinals were gathered. He heard them arguing loudly over land and money. "Vespucci got 2 provinces last month. I need a new bishopric for my nephew," one cried out, his voice slurred by wine. The debate was not about God or saving souls, but about which family member could claim which piece of the church's enormous wealth and power. It was a kingdom of greed, built on the foundations of faith. Alessandro escaped to a small balcony, struggling for air. The soft mountain boy he had been was dying, suffocated by the stench of sin in Rome. He now understood that the historical records, the diaries and correspondence that would later emerge, were not lies. They were the truth of this terrible, broken house. He had witnessed the stark contrast between the teachings of Christ and the daily, depraved actions of his supposed representatives. He realized the church was not being protected by God. It was being manipulated and devoured by the very men sworn to protect it. Alessandro was no longer just a scribe. He was an unwilling witness to the greatest betrayal in Christendom. After the terrible banquet, Brother Alessandro found his duties had shifted. He was no longer just copying sermons. Cardinal Vespucci now tasked him with organizing the highly secret financial records. These were not the public accounts of the church, but the ledgers detailing how the Pope's inner circle and the Pope himself spent the sacred funds. The numbers Alessandro wrote made his hands tremble. He discovered that the church's machinery was not just ignoring sin. It was being actively manipulated to pay for it. The Pope, who was supposed to be poor like Christ, controlled a vast fortune, and he was using it entirely to serve his own family and political goals. One set of records detailed massive amounts of money being diverted. This money was meant for building hospitals, feeding the poor, or for the grand reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica. Instead, the entries read, "Payment to Commander Cesare Borgia for the purchase of troops and arms." Cesare, the Pope's son, was raising an army to conquer new lands in Italy. Alessandro realized the Holy Treasury was financing a personal war, a political power grab, all in the name of the Church. The Pope was using the devotion of millions of people to make his son a duke or a prince. Another entry read, "Expense for the dowry of Donna Lucrezia Borgia." Lucrezia, the Pope's daughter, was being married to powerful nobles to secure political alliances. Her wedding dowry was astronomical, funded directly by the offerings and tithes of simple, faithful farmers and villagers who believed their money was saving souls. The cardinals, including Vespucci, discussed these transactions openly, framing them as entirely ordinary political dealings, not moral failings. "We must secure the dynasty," Cardinal Vespucci declared to a visiting official one afternoon. "If the Borgia family is strong, the papacy is strong. It is simple statecraft. We are protecting God's kingdom on earth, and that requires gold, and it requires blood." Alessandro understood the chilling truth. These men saw the church not as a spiritual calling, but as the ultimate political tool. Its immense spiritual authority was the perfect cover for unchecked personal indulgence. Their lavish lifestyles, their parties, their mistresses, and their children's armies were all paid for by the spiritual fear and hope of every Catholic in Europe. He saw one letter detailing a new tax levied on a poor, far-off German province. The tax was so high it would certainly lead to famine. The reason for the tax was simply to buy the Pope a magnificent, jewel-encrusted gift for his mistress. This was the cruelty behind the gold. It wasn't just that the popes were enjoying luxury. It was that this luxury was crushing the very people they were supposed to protect. The sin was not just in the sleeping arrangements. It was in the starvation of the poor, all to fund the family ambitions of one man. One evening, Alessandro sat copying the list of guests who would attend Lucrezia's next wedding. He looked at the names of the dukes and counts, all of them rich and powerful, buying a link to the papal power through marriage. He realized that the gold that bought their alliance had been taken from the hands of the dying. He thought of the poor priest he had seen beaten in the courtyard in chapter 1. That priest had likely questioned these financial dealings. He had dared to call the Pope's political acts a moral failing. The brutal violence was simply the Church's machinery defending its financial manipulation. The only way to survive this machine, Alessandro realized, was to give up his soul entirely and believe the lie, that this depraved indulgence was necessary for the survival of the Holy Roman Church. But the gold was too heavy, and the lie was too big. It was a weight that would soon crush the entire church. As Brother Alessandro continued to serve Cardinal Vespucci, he learned that the most shocking thing about Rome was not the sin itself, but how openly and casually it was done. The corruption was not hidden in shadows. It was simply a part of daily business. One cold morning, Alessandro was told to prepare the most formal contract he had ever seen. The room was tense. The visitors were the Della Rata family, rich bankers from Florence. They were there to buy a spiritual title for their youngest son. The son, Giacomo Della Rata, was a young man no older than Alessandro. Giacomo sat fidgeting, clearly bored. He wore expensive clothes and smelled of perfume, but his eyes were empty. He was not a spiritual man. He looked like he belonged on a horse, not at an altar. Cardinal Vespucci began the negotiation. This was a clear example of simony, the ancient and forbidden act of selling church offices. The Holy Father respects your family's deep pockets, Signor Della Rata. Vespucci purred to the father. A bishopric is a great honor. The office of the Bishop of Medina is currently open. It is wealthy, and it controls powerful lands. And the price? The father asked, cutting straight to the point. No mention of God, faith, or Medina's poor. Vespucci named a sum of gold so enormous that Alessandro almost dropped his quill. It was enough money to build 5 cathedrals. And we must, of course, Vespucci continued, guarantee loyalty to the Pope's family, the Borgias. Bishop Giacomo will ensure Medina's taxes go to the papal treasury, and specifically, certain funds will be directed to the upkeep of the Pope's son, Cesare's army. Alessandro watched as Giacomo's father happily agreed. The deal was done. A sacred, powerful position that demanded a lifetime of spiritual study, prayer, and devotion was sold, like a sack of grain, to a spoiled, ignorant young man simply because of his familial connections and his father's wealth. This was how the culture of corruption was maintained. The men in charge of saving souls were only saving seats for their family and friends. This was nepotism in action, where spiritual qualification meant nothing compared to gold and bloodline. Alessandro thought back to his old monastery. The priests there had spent decades studying holy books, fasting, and sacrificing their lives for the poor. They were the men who deserved to be bishops. But men like them would never sit in the high seats of power. Those seats were reserved for men like Giacomo, who now held the power to command hundreds of priests, judge people's souls, and control vast territories, all because his father paid the price of a soul. As Alessandro copied the final lines of the agreement, transferring the sacred authority to Giacomo, he felt a piece of his own faith snap inside him. He saw Giacomo later that day, laughing loudly as he boasted to a friend about the hunting lodge in Medina that came with his new title. "I won't even have to go to church that often," Giacomo bragged, totally uncaring about the office he had just bought. Alessandro realized that the whole structure of the church was a rotting scaffold. The men at the top did not just commit secret sins. They built a system designed to reward the most worldly, the most sinful, and the most corrupt. Every man who bought a title brought more gold and more corruption into the system, pushing out any chance of true spiritual leadership. The sale of offices was not a secret crime. It was the ordinary foundation of the papal state. The spiritual life of Europe was being governed by bankers and spoiled boys. Brother Alessandro had spent months copying lies. His soul felt heavy, weighted down by every contract he wrote and every corrupt number he recorded. He had seen the Pope and the cardinals treat the sacred church as a personal bank and a political weapon. He lived every day knowing the highest men of God were the cruelest liars. Because of this constant knowledge, Alessandro stopped sleeping well. He became quiet, too quiet. He watched his master, Cardinal Vespucci, with new, fearful eyes. And Vespucci, a man trained in deceit, began to notice Alessandro's silence. One afternoon, Alessandro was told to clear out an old, forgotten storage cabinet behind Vespucci's grand desk. It was full of dusty papers from previous years. As he sifted through the brittle documents, his fingers touched something different. Not a formal letter, but a small, heavy book bound in old, worn leather. It was a personal diary. The book belonged to a canon who had served Vespucci's predecessor, a man who had died suddenly and mysteriously 10 years earlier. Alessandro felt a strange pull. He quickly opened it and began to read, his heart hammering in his chest. The pages were filled with the honest records of a man who had witnessed the same darkness Alessandro now saw. The entries detailed the cruelty and moral hypocrisy in graphic, terrible detail. Today, the Holy Father spoke of fasting, yet his dinner table groaned under the weight of gold plate, and his mistress wore a necklace of stolen jewels. One entry read. Another passage was even worse, describing a terrifying event at the Vatican. The young woman, she was brought into the Pope's chambers crying. Later, she was paid off and sent away. I saw the gold coins given to her brother to keep his silence. The Holy City is a den of sin, not a house of prayer. The Pope acts like a beast. The final entries were full of fear. The canon wrote about how he had found his notes missing, how he felt eyes on him, and how he worried he would be silenced for knowing the truth. The last line simply read, "They know I write." Alessandro knew the canon had not died a peaceful death. He was the next victim in the long line of individuals who faced brutality at the hands of the church's authority for speaking the truth. Suddenly, a cough broke the silence. Alessandro snapped the diary shut and hid it under his tunic. It was Marco, the cardinal's chief steward, a cold, sharp-eyed man who was always loyal to money and power. "What have you found, brother?" Marco asked, his eyes narrowing. "Only old tax receipts, Marco. I will burn them," Alessandro replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Marco stepped closer. "You read them, though. You read more than you were meant to. I saw the way you look at the cardinal, Alessandro. You have the look of a man who keeps two sets of books, one for us and one for his own dangerous memory." Alessandro knew he had been caught. He had found the truth, but that truth had made him a target. He now held the ultimate piece of evidence, the historical record of corruption, and it was a death sentence. That night, Cardinal Vespucci called Alessandro into his office. Vespucci did not shout. He simply smiled, and the smile was colder than the marble walls. "Alessandro, you have worked hard, but I have heard whispers that your soul is troubled. Perhaps you are too sensitive for Rome. I have arranged for you to take a long journey to a distant, quiet monastery. You will leave at dawn." The cardinal was not rewarding him. He was sending Alessandro away to be disappeared. This was the moment of betrayal. Alessandro knew he would never reach that quiet monastery. He had to run, and he had to take the proof with him. He had traded the cage of gold for the knowledge of fire. The moment Brother Alessandro left Cardinal Vespucci's presence, he knew he was a dead man. The quiet, cold threat of being sent to a distant monastery was a simple instruction for his murder. He clutched the heavy, stolen diary under his tunic. It was his only weapon and his ultimate burden. He could not wait for dawn. That night, under the sliver of a crescent moon, Alessandro began his desperate escape. He shed his expensive, silk-lined tunic and put on his old, plain brown robes, the uniform of a man who owned nothing. He moved like a shadow through the corridors that had once seemed so magnificent but now felt like the maze of a tomb. He managed to slip past the few sleeping guards, avoiding the courtyards where he had seen the beatings. When he reached the heavy bronze gate of the palace, he did not hesitate. He offered the sleepy, low-ranking guard the only thing of value he still possessed, the ornate silver cross he had been given when he first entered Rome. "It is blessed," Alessandro whispered, pushing the cross into the guard's hand. "May it buy you a safe journey, friend. I am leaving this place forever." The guard looked at the bribe, then at the frantic young man, and chose the silver over his duty. He quietly unbarred the small side door. Alessandro ran. He ran through the narrow, twisting streets of Rome, which smelled of garbage and neglect, finally bursting through the city's outer gates just as the first weak light touched the eastern sky. He did not stop running until the great dome of St. Peter's was nothing but a low bump on the horizon. He traveled north for days, exhausted and starved, but driven by the pages he carried. The diary was not just a book. It was the physical proof that the center of the world was rotting. Finally, Alessandro reached a prosperous town in the hills, far from the direct, crushing power of the Pope's guard. He hoped to find safety, but what he found was something far more powerful than safety. He found voice. In the town square, a large crowd was gathered, buzzing with energy and anger. They were not listening to a gentle priest or a scholar. They were listening to a man standing on a wooden crate, a fiery, common preacher. The man was dressed in rough wool, his face thin with passion. The preacher did not speak Latin. He spoke the simple, angry Italian of the people, and he spoke the truth Alessandro had been forced to silence. "Do you see their robes?" the preacher roared, pointing an imaginary finger south toward Rome. "They are red with your money. They preach poverty, but they build golden thrones for their illegitimate children. They sell salvation for gold. They are not shepherds. They are thieves." The crowd shouted back in agreement. The resentment that had been quietly building for decades, fueled by heavy taxes, sold offices, and the blatant moral hypocrisy, was now erupting into open calls for reform. The preacher spoke exactly of the corruption Alessandro had witnessed: the sale of bishoprics to unworthy men, the cruelty toward anyone who spoke up, and the manipulation of sacred wealth for family ambition. The preacher didn't name the names, but he didn't have to. The people knew. Every word confirmed Alessandro's desperate journey. Alessandro stood on the edge of the crowd, tears streaming down his face. He finally understood the true meaning of the small, terrible diary pressing against his chest. His suffering was not just a personal failure of faith. It was a single drop in a vast, swelling ocean of anger. He knew that across Europe, men were reading pamphlets and letters, exchanging stories, and finding their own angry voices. The system of lies, gold, and depraved indulgence that the popes had perfected was unstable, could not last. The foundation of faith was crumbling, and a new structure, built on honesty and direct truth, was demanded. Alessandro, the former scribe who was meant to copy lies, looked at the diary in his hands. This little book, this historical record of the Pope's sins, was more valuable than all the gold in the Vatican. He had survived the golden cage. He now held the spark. The fire of reform was coming, and Alessandro, the quiet witness, would be ready to feed it the truth. The long night of corruption, he realized with a powerful certainty, was finally violently ending.